Welcome to Daraja Press Podcasts. I'm Firoz Manji. On this episode, we speak with Michael Neocosmos about his book, Beyond the Neocolonial, Africa and the Dialectics of Human Emancipation.
Fundamentally, any transformation which is emancipatory has to have some idea of what is common for everyone. What does everyone need in common?
In an era defined by neocolonial capitalism, resurgent fascism, and the horrifying spectacle of genocide and invasions of Iran, the need for a new emancipatory politics has never been more urgent. Today, I'm speaking with Professor Michael Neocosmos, who confronts this global crisis head on in his groundbreaking new work, Beyond the Neocolonial, Africa and the Dialectics of Human Emancipation. Refusing the comfortable confines of liberal critique, Michael Neocosmos issues a radical challenge. To think freedom, we must break away with the very state modes of thought that imprison us. I was really impressed reading this book because it draws on inspiration from ancient Egypt, pre-Socratic philosophy, and contemporary African social movements. And he makes a powerful case for reviving dialectical thought, a way of thinking that grasps the world not as a static set of classifications, but as a process of constant movement and of becoming. The book centers on the often silenced voices of the oppressed, exploring how the collective intelligence of popular struggles, expressed through proverbs and community assemblies like the Palaver, contains the latent potential for a universal politics of equality. From the revolutionary experiments of Haitian Bossales to the anti-apartheid uprisings in South Africa, Neocosmos unearths histories of genuine popular sovereignty, analyzing why they succeed, how they were defeated, and what lessons they hold for us today. Beyond the Neocolonial is not just a work of political theory, it is an urgent invitation to think and to act for a future beyond domination and a future based on human emancipation. Welcome, Michael. Great to have you on our show.
Thank you very much, Firoz. Thank you for having me.
So, Michael, there are a number of things I think would be nice to discuss today. And let me just start with how the book argues that the central problem of our time is not simply capitalism or simply imperialism, but specifically, and I quote, neocolonial capitalism. Could you elaborate on what you mean by this term and why making this distinction is so crucial for political analyses today?
Well, I think we need to just begin at the beginning. Remember that when Marx talks about in part 8 of Capital 1, the so-called primitive accumulation, when he starts talking about the origins of capitalism, he basically says that capitalism originates from the discovery of the Americas, and that the discovery of the Americas goes along with colonial oppression and coercion, which is undertaken by a state. So colonialism and capitalism are both combined. It's not possible to have capitalism without colonialism. And it's not, in fact, simply the case that colonialism only exists or existed as primitive accumulation. It continues throughout the expansion of capitalism throughout the world, as people like Luxembourg and others understood. So it is important to note that colonial capitalism is different from imperialism. Imperialism, was understood, at least in the 19th century by people like Hobson, Hilferding, Lenin, and others, to have developed along with the growth of monopolies and finance capitalism through finance capitals throughout the world. Colonialism, on the other hand, is something else. Colonialism is about the domination and the coercion and the oppression of those societies or those systems which come under the ambit of empire, the ones which are actually dominated and colonized. And for that to happen, you require a state. So, in other words, you can't have colonialism without a colonial state. I know that early on there were private companies that undertook colonial domination, like the British India, company, and so on. But eventually, it turns down that you need power, you need a state to be able to dominate over the populations that you are colonizing.
I mean, they weren't doing it independent of the state. They were, in a sense, outsourced
They were That's right.
by the state.
I think that's the right expression. They were outsourced until the state itself takes over and does its own job. So you have a colonial state, and so colonialism cannot exist without a state, and therefore it's important to understand colonialism as a political process, not just an economic process of exploitation, of the extraction of resources, of the plunder of resources, of the opening of markets, of the exploitation of labor power, and so on, but basically as a political process, because without that political process, without that state, imperial extraction of resources couldn't possibly operate. It's quite clear, you need power to be able to enable the extraction of resources. So what happens then is that central to colonialism, I think we could define colonialism as a process of dehumanization. Because in order to be able to dominate and control people politically and socially, you need to be able to assert that they are somehow inferior, that they're not real human beings, and therefore is justified to control them, which is precisely what happens not only with the discovery of the Americas, but throughout what we now call the global South, Africa and Asia, and so on. So colonialism goes along with racism. And, people like Cedric Robinson have spoken about racial capitalism. I think it's possibly even more important to talk about colonial capitalism, because colonialism is what requires racism and therefore the differentiation between human beings. And in fact, the assertion that some human beings are not really human at all, and therefore it's legitimate to go around controlling them and exploiting them.
Cedric Robinson talks about racial capitalism, but is there any other form of capitalism?
No, there isn't. No, there isn't. But I mean, I'm trying to, rather than talking about the racial issue, I want to talk about the political issue of colonial domination, which is a political question. I don't want to be diverted into question of racial identities or racial differences. Clearly, it's a myth. Clearly, it's an invention, but it's there in order to enable colonial domination. And I think that's what's important. Colonial domination is required by the expansion of capitalism. The domination of other peoples is required by the expansion of capitalism. But that's a political process, because it's not automatic that people are just going to sit back and say, you dehumanize us, wonderful, good for you. We're just going to carry on as if nothing happened. So now the question arises, we are still in colonial capitalism, but the question arises then, what happens after independence on the African continent? Does colonialism stop, or does colonialism continue in different forms? Does the extraction of resources, does the plunder of raw materials, does the exploitation of labor power, and so on and so on, and the extraction of resources from the African continent end? And obviously, we know it doesn't. So I think we can, therefore, think that in fact As colonialism needed a form of state in order to enable it, neocolonial domination also needs a form of state to enable it. It's not possible for neocolonialism to continue or colonialism to continue in different forms without there being a power, a state within African countries which enable that continuation. And I think that is the problem that we have been facing until recently. And I say until recently because it seems that under Trump, we are reverting back to standard colonialism in many ways. Okay, not just the subtle forms of neocolonialism. But anyway, let's assume that we can speak in terms of neocolonialism. And therefore, if that is the case, we can speak in terms of neocolonial capitalism. So, uniformly, we could say that after independence, even though some African states may have tried to take a different path outside colonial domination, more or less, ultimately, they all ended up being dominated by foreign interests in alliance with those in power. And it's only because of the alliance of those in power that the foreign interests have been able to secure their interests. I mean, it's always the case. If you want to dominate people, you can't just do it without having, without having local elites or local whatever there who help you. I mean, it's not possible.
Decentralized despotism, as
Well, I mean,
Mamdali put it.
well, whatever. I mean, whatever you call it, you have to have some people there whose interests are in line with yours.
With
And
yours.
yeah, and who therefore say, come along, you can extract resources on condition that you give us money, that you enable us to continue in power, that whatever. So the state, the difficulty then is one of understanding the nature of the neocolonial state. And that is what the book ends with, in a sense. The book is a transition to understanding that the nature of a neocolonial state.
I mean, I think the important distinction that you're making is it is not neocolonialism, it is neocolonial capitalism. And I mean, in that sense, that distinguishes from our friend Kwame Nkrumah, who talked about neocolonialism as
Yes.
a very distinct political form. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Nkrumah's in the state. He runs the state and he sees power outside dominating him. So he says, "No, I can't keep away from these guys. They're constantly wanting resources." But it is neocolonial capitalism because capitalism works within the neocolonized societies, and it works in such a way that, I mean, we could say, I mean, there have been various different theories of the neocolonial state, but one very important one is Wamba's idea that the neocolonial state is grafted upon an existing colonial one. So there isn't a transformation at independence of that colonial state in order to ensure that the new state is rooted in African communities. It's not the state. The state is mimetic. It just copies the European form. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
even to the point of having kind of multi-partyism in the 80s and 90s. Bring in political parties like the Europeans tell us we should have, and so on and so on and so on. So the state and society itself, which the state molds, is obviously a capitalist society, but it has features. It has features, neocolonial features.
One of the things that really comes across in the book is your call for return to the dialectic, but distinguish it from the historicist and Marxist formulations of the past. How do you define a political dialectic that you're proposing? And why is it a necessary antidote to analytical thought, which you critique as being inherent to state power?
I think we should start by saying, I mean, it's not so much a critique of analytical thought. Look, I mean, I think there are two broad orientations, visions of how to understand the world in philosophy, in general theory, and so on. One is analytical, and the other one is dialectical. Analytical thought starts from classifications, from taxonomies. It divides the world up into branches of knowledge, into different compartments, and says we must analyze these separately. The most obvious inventor of this is a man called Linnaeus. If you've ever been to Sweden, to Uppsala, they take you to the garden, his gardens. And you can see here the plants. I mean, he classifies all the plants and puts them in different categories. That is, if you like, the foundation of analytical thought, is division, dividing in order to be able to understand. This has a number of consequences. One of the consequences is a comparative analysis. You've got this thing and another thing, and you can compare them. They are separate, they are distinct. They've been classified separately. Another is hierarchies. You can put some things above other things. You classify them. You say the more important, the more advanced, the more developed. The less important, the less developed, and so on. Binaries that are constantly used these days in order to understand, for example, the state, are rooted in this. For example, democratic versus authoritarian. Yeah. So you have democratic states, you have authoritarian states, some are better than others, and you compare the two and so on. And then there's rural, urban. Some people use citizen subject. There's these binaries through which we are supposed to understand the world. Another consequence of this mode of analysis, this mode of thinking, is that cause is always external to what happens. So if you want to look at the cause of an event or the cause of something, you look outside. Like, for example, a billiard ball. You hit a billiard ball with a thing and then it moves. So it has an impact, there's an impact on it and then it moves. So they're two distinct issues, cause and effect, are separate. And a final one, perhaps, is a reference to and that is another point which needs to be made is that the reference point in all social or political thinking happens to be the West, the white man, liberal democracy. In other words, that is supposed to be the ideal, has to be attained, and the rest of the world has to somehow is compared to that ideal and has to develop to achieve that ideal and so on. All this is the result of analytical modes of thought. Okay, that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we have dialectical modes of thought, dialectical mode of thought, or dialectical political subjectivities, if you like. And here, the easiest reference would be, rather than Linnaeus, would be Darwin. Because Darwin is talking about the evolution of species throughout history over thousands of years as being the result of changes in the environment. So if you have a change in the environment, some species can adapt to that change and transform themselves so that they continue existing in an altered form, but they continue existing. And others can't do it and perish. So when he means the survival of the fittest, he means the survival of the most able to adapt themselves to changes. And that's fascinating because that's what dialectic thought is. Dialectic ultimately, when at least the way I use it in the political dialectic, as opposed to, say, dialectical logic or whatever, which I want to insist on because that's what I'm looking at, is when something and its place or location are in contradiction. Everything, you could say, exists, everything that exists is placed or is located somewhere. A word is in a sentence, people are located in relation to other people, atoms are connected with other atoms, they're never on their own. So when there is a contradiction between something and its place, then you have a change, a dialectical transformation. And we can see that precisely in politics when people who find themselves in a specific location and they find themselves as being oppressed say, we don't want to be oppressed anymore. We want to move out of our location, which is oppressing us. And we want to do something else. So there's a contradiction that arises between the way people are thinking. We're not acting as slaves anymore. Yeah, for example, in the case of slave rebellions, we want to be human beings like everyone else. We want to be free like everyone else. So then, in a sense, they are transcending their place. They're saying, we don't want to be located in this place of the slave anymore. We want to be equal with all other human beings. So that you have then a contradiction, hmm, between the people concerned and the place in which they are located in, which is the place of slavery. And they said, no, we are human beings. You know, we are not slaves. Right? So you have, in a sense, an important contradiction. And that is what the dialectic or dialectical thought is. Because as a result of this contradiction between a thing with these people in this instance and their place and their location, change occurs. So dialectics is all, in a sense, about change, transformation, movement, and so on. And there's a process, because clearly there's a process of the slaves freeing themselves and becoming fully human beings. It's not just something that happens automatically. It has to happen subjectively. And this is what a dialectic of politics is. It is a subjective transformation, a becoming of something else. So that, in a sense, is what an emancipatory politics would have to be based on some form of the dialectic. And in particular, a form of the dialectic, in a sense, transcends or overcomes the limitations of place in order to speak about universal humanity. You know, we are human beings like you are. We want to be considered as human beings. We do not want to be dehumanized. You know, César refers to it as thingification, chosification in French, right? So he's saying people say we want to be humans. That means they're making a statement about humanity as a whole. They're not just simply saying we want to be slave owners like you are slave owners. You know what I mean? Some of them might say it, but it's only emancipatory when that idea of the human in general, or general of humanity, is referred to as the objective or the object of politics.
Isn't it true that it isn't just proclamation and assertion of humanity, but it's also an invention of what it means to be human?
Well, of course,
I
it's a
mean, it's a
political process.
it breaks through that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
even that barrier. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's not just an assertion. It's not, you know, it's not going up onto the rooftops and saying we are human. I mean, it's a way, in a sense, of proving it through your actions with others, the same as you, and of developing a politics which can achieve that level of humanity. Yeah, yeah. You know, so it's not just simply an assertion, you know. So that's why dialectical thought is at the center of all politics of emancipation in one form or another. And I think a number of classical Marxist thinkers were, grasp that idea. Not necessarily consistently, but they certainly grasped it. And in fact, when you have a struggle, when you have these popular struggles, and people in these popular struggles say, we want to be free, it's not always clearly defined what freedom means. One of the underlying assumptions, at least in my experience, is we want to have control over our lives. We want to be the same as you. We want to have the same benefits. We want to be able to go to work, and so on. We want to be able not to be exploited and so on and so on. Yeah. So it's sometimes quite vague, but nevertheless, I think there is this underlying idea in one way or another that there is some form of equality involved.
Your book, you really go into the rich potential of African popular culture. You draw on people like Cabral, Wamba Diawamba, and you have even a chapter which deals with proverbs and institutions like the Palaver. Be quite interesting, I think, for listeners to actually have some understanding what the Palaver was. There are different forms of it across the continent. In Kenya, for example, you
Yeah.
have originally the Baraza and so on. And to what extent are these sources of emancipatory politics? How can these traditions be activated today as sort of political resources, and what's the risk of them being co-opted or being romanticized?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I mean, there's all these risks about it. But let's start talking a little bit about African proverbs, because one of the things that usually happens is that African proverbs are kind of situated within a museum of past objects. This is what Africans used to say in the past. They're like being put in a museum, or else they say, yeah, it's true. It's part of tradition, and tradition is over there. We can carry on with being developed like the whites now, this kind of thing. That was quaint. Or we might bring it up once in a while as the African way of doing things. And sometimes it's quite systematically distorted. But for example, there's a proverb which says, I think it's an account proverb from Ghana. It says, "It is the human that counts. If I call gold, it does not respond. If I call cloth, it does not respond. It is the human that counts." So the idea here is that there is an understanding of humanity in general. Yeah, that humans are the center. They should be at the center of thinking. That humanity is what matters. All the rest is kind of superficial. That's interesting. There's another one which I want to mention just in passing, which I like very much, which says, "A single voice is an empty calabash." I think that is absolutely fantastic for me. In other words, what matters is a collective voice, is a collectivity. You can read that in different ways. You can read it like, it's the community. But you could read it politically to say that there's a political collective which is much more important than one particular person talking. One particular person might be useful, like the calabash is useful, but if there's nothing inside, that's all it is. It's an empty calabash. So these are two examples of proverbs which refer to the universal, which refer to humanity in general, which refer to collectivities, which refer to the centrality and the importance of the collective, huh? And not just the importance of the individual. And I think those ways of thinking are absolutely fundamental. The point that I'm trying to make is, of course, they only exist there as potentially political. They're not in themselves political. They have to be activated. And they have to be activated by a collectivity. If a collectivity comes together and says, no, we agree, a single voice is an empty calabash. We have to constitute a collective voice. It's not just simply a matter of having this individual plus that individual plus that individual. We have to have a collective voice, eh, in order to be able to achieve anything. In other words, in order to be able to transcend our place collectively, like I was saying earlier, we need to have a collective voice and we need to engage in collective action. In other words, we could activate these already existing proverbs which are there and which are said to be the voice of the ancestors, because the ancestors are the ones who were making these utterances. That's what we learned it from. It's been passed down over the years. So they've got several sensible things to say, and therefore we can learn from them. And that brings me now to the question of the Palaver, because within the Palaver, this is what happens. So the Palaver is absolutely fundamental. I mean, it's a fundamental institution. Unfortunately, it's not always quite so prevalent as it used to be. But if we sit down and think and ask ourselves the question, what is the fundamental or the most important element of politics? Most people today would say, politics is power. You have to achieve power. But in fact, without constituting a collectivity, it's pointless to even try to do anything like achieving power. So the fundamental, the most important aspect of politics, especially of an emancipatory politics, is constituting a collective. constituting a collectivity of people, bringing in a group together so that people can think along what they want to achieve, what are the problems that they want to solve, how they're going to go about it, where they're going to move, and so on and so on. So you have to have some kind of, to put it crudely, a meeting. I mean, it's no good saying, like people write, the journalists say, we have to do this and we have to do that. We have to fight xenophobia. Who's the we? So how do you constitute a we? How do you constitute, how do you ensure that a we occurs which has, in a sense, a single way of thinking, a unified way of thinking, and therefore can achieve something in uniform? Because when there's lots of people together, there's all sorts of disagreements, as we know. There's all sorts of interests which are conflicting. A meeting should be able to confront these divergences, these differences, and these different interests in order to produce a unity, a unified perspective. And in a sense, this is what the Palaver does. The Palaver is a very, very long process. I mean, I'm basically influenced by the work of Wamba Diawamba on this, and it's important for people to try and read as much of Wamba as possible, but I try and discuss some of his work in the book. So basically, Palavers are ways of bringing the community together when the community is in crisis, when for some reason or other things are not operating properly, when someone says, this is not occurring as it should be occurring, then a palaver can be called in order to bring people together, in order to discuss this particular issue. Even if there is a disagreement between our community and another community, you can bring palavers together, Where is the boundary of the community? Was this person right to come and help themselves to fruit from our trees? Is it in our boundary, or is it within our community, or is it within someone else's? There has to be a discussion because there is a crisis regarding where do the boundaries of our community end, where do they begin, and so on. So there could be all sorts of crises, and in fact, the palavra, it comes from the Portuguese word palavra. Yeah? It goes on for a long time. And everyone is allowed to speak. What's interesting is precisely that people refer to the ancestors all the time and to proverbs. People say that, the ancestors said this. And then another person says, well, the ancestors also said this. And this way, the disagreements are thrashed out. And there are some dominant individuals, Wamba calls them the Nzonzi. The Nzonzi are the ones who guide the process and who are encouraging everyone to speak. You're not supposed just to sit there and say nothing. Why are you sitting there and saying nothing? Are you hiding something? Is there something that you should, and so on. And then they say, well, we have achieved this, and they put it in different words. And then there's songs, and then there's whatever, everyone comes together and blah, 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 blah. So there is a way in which it is a very complex, I mean, I'm just going over the surface of it. But there's a very complex way of resolving contradictions between people, resolving differences between people in order to reestablish the health of the community. Huh? It's not just simply a way, I mean, that, as you say, there's different ways in which it works in different parts of the continent. And in some places, I think it can be described as conflict resolution mechanism, for example. But it's not just fundamentally, it's not just a conflict resolution. It's not just about, this group and that group coming together and saying, let's resolve our conflicts. No, it's much more fundamental. I mean, the way Wamba describes it, conflict resolution is just, compromise. We compromise this way, you compromise that way, It's like collective bargaining, right? Over the table, what they say, called collective bargaining in the West. It's not a matter of bargaining. It's a way of reconstituting the whole community as a unity. And you have to start from the assumption that what you want is unity. And a lot of what it involves might be criticism and self-criticism in the way in which communist parties years ago used to sometimes refer to, not always, but there has to be, in order to advance, we have to have criticism and self-criticism. Not in order to undermine people, but in order to say, right, we did something wrong here. We need to advance and do things this way, that way, or that the other.
You're listening to the Daraja Press podcast. Daraja is the Kiswahili word for bridge. As its name suggests, Daraja Press seeks to build bridges, especially bridges of solidarity between and amongst movements, intellectuals, and those engaged in struggles for a just world. Check out our other episodes, books, and more at darajapress.com. So now let's get back to the show. But it's also sort of transformative process. I mean, the dialectic operates within that as well. It's not just a resolution of different
No,
viewpoints,
exactly.
but the creation of something new,
Something
the
new.
transformation, the becoming of something else.
Yeah, a new community develops. A new community. You can't go back to the old community because a major conflict or a conflict has occurred. You can't go back to the status quo until you can't. You can't. You have to produce something completely new. And so you're right. So it's not just about, a collective bargaining or conflict resolution. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that brings us, a nice segue into this issue that because you're very consistent throughout the book that it's the masses that make history, that people think. I think one of the profoundest weaknesses of the left generally today is this failure to recognize that people think, that there is this vanguardism, that they have to think for the masses
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
as opposed to listening. So how do we as intellectuals and activists move out of that paternalistic view of popular movements and really engage in the rationality and inventiveness of those who are most oppressed?
Well, clearly, the oppressed are the ones who are, at least if not always, able to fully understand their oppression. They know that their oppression is taking place. So one has to listen to what they have to say. That's the first point to make, and it's pretty obvious, but I know that some people think they already have the solution. And that therefore theory tells us this, so therefore we don't need to listen to what anybody says. What I mean when I say that people think, I think it must be understood as a capacity that we all have. All humans have the capacity to think. That doesn't mean we always exercise it, but we always have the capacity to think. So that I use it specifically here to refer to that instance where people are able to think beyond their narrow interests. When they're able to say, my oppression has got something, we have something in common with your oppression. And therefore, together, we can achieve something else, something we can go beyond simply our narrow interests, as this identity, for example. I mentioned identity on purpose because identity politics is so dominant everywhere. So people tend to think in terms of identities, but to think beyond that and to think the universal, to think that, in fact, if you're oppressed as this group or that group or the other group, it might have something to do with the form of oppression and not simply because you happen to belong to this group or to that group. Capitalism, to come back to this fundamental, oppresses politically different groups, whether it is blacks, women, different this ethnic group, that ethnic group, or whatever. But the point is, it cannot just be any one of those particular groups, because if, say, we want a better position within the existing system, you can't say that because it doesn't transform the system at all. You're only just reshuffling. If you want to talk about emancipation, you have to think beyond your immediate interests to talk about how to achieve a universal equality eventually. And one of the ways of achieving it is within our movement, within our organization, to achieve a certain level of equality already. So there has to be a way in which leaders, if they think of themselves as leaders or if they are nominated as leaders, listen to what people say and are delegates, not just representatives. We delegate you to go and do this, that, and the other, and you come back and you report and you say what you've done. And if you haven't said what you've done, then you're out. So that's how it was. That's how it has been in various forms of struggle. So leaders cannot decide just because they have read one or two books of Marx by Marx or Lenin that they already know the answers. In fact, it's not. You have to start always by the specific conditions in which people find themselves. And those conditions in which people find themselves hopefully enables them to organize some kind of movement. And therefore, you engage, or you have to engage as intellectuals or whatever the case may be with that kind of movement. Now, having said that, there's a major difficulty. The major difficulty has been clear throughout the whole history of leftist struggles. I'm talking principally of the Marxist tradition, because the Marxist tradition has always insisted that precisely you have to have an organization and a movement. Sometimes the organization is seen as more important. Other times a movement or movements are seen as more important. And you can see this in Lenin's What Is to Be Done. I mean, it's precisely what it's about. It's about the creation of a party as an organization. Because, and I think this is one of the important points of his argument, incidentally, is that he says when people resist or they rebel, they tend to be influenced by the conditions in which they're living. So, if people don't have money, they'll say, oh, no, we are poor. If people are in trade unions and say we're not getting paid enough, it is, well, we want to get more pay, or we want better conditions on the assembly lines, or this or that or the other. In other words, forms of rebellion is dictated by the conditions in which they live. Huh? It's people's material conditions which determine their consciousness, not the other way around, as Marx says, right? So, in a sense, that is true. That is why there's a problem with social movements today, because when you say social movements, you're simply referring to a specific social category. So it's women's movements, youth movements, peasant movements, student movements. In other words, it's a specific category which is rebelling, resisting, and wanting to change the world. Né? But Lenin says you have to think about things in a wider context because you're confronting the state. And the state raises all sorts of issues, not simply the issues which concern you in your narrow domain, but more broadly, more universal things. And I think that is crucial. You need a wider organization which can address broader issues. But his solution is a vanguard party. And we now know that, in fact, this has obviously been a disaster over the years. So the idea is not to have parties in the traditional sense anymore, because all parties tend to be vanguardist in one way or another. They think they know they have the answers. You see, this problem, the fundamental problem, is how do you link an organization or central organization or whatever you want to call it, which is not a party. Maybe we would talk about that in a minute, and the mass movement. How do you link the two together? How you do it in such a way that one doesn't dominate over the other. In other words, that the party or the organization doesn't dominate over the movement and goes around telling people what to do. But on the other hand, that you're able to develop a broad analysis which confronts all sorts of issues and not just simply the narrow ones which the social movement is concerned with. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think this, there are lessons to be drawn from Mao and the way in which cadres would go into village and constantly go back, come
Yes.
back, evolve, And so it was not a static process, it was a constant one where the party was influenced by the thinking of the masses and returned back its analysis and then got back into. So there was a constant, and it's when it becomes disengaged from that that I think the party actually
Yes,
has no existence.
yes, yes. And that's when, and I think you're absolutely right. That's precisely what Mao says, and I think that's very informative. But that's what happens when the party achieves state power. Because then there's a complete disengagement. I mean, they know we have the answers. We have knowledge. We have power. We have knowledge. We know what is best for you. Just have confidence in us, comrade. We will sort out or as they say here, we will manage the transition. Yeah. I always think it's hilarious. You know where they come from when they say they're managing the transition. It's analytical. It's precisely what we were talking about earlier. They
Yeah,
manage through analyzing, you see?
yeah,
There's no
yeah,
longer any process. There's no longer any constant process of becoming. There is no longer any constant process of developing and of thinking that you want to achieve. You want to achieve this in the future, and that when you
yes.
achieve that, you have to work achieve something else. You have to think the present in the light of the future in any struggle. Yeah. And that way, you can advance. If not, that's
Become
it.
disengaged. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. The snake just becomes completely cut off.
Let's move on to I think some very important issues that you've raised in your book, and in particular, I'm talking about the Haitian Revolution. When everyone talks about the successful revolution led by
Toussaint.
key figures, yes, and you point out that actually the very leadership of that movement actually wanted to reinstate the previous conditions of the population, but that there was a complete break with that. There was a complete different movement of which very little is talked about. And you talk about the Bossales, the creation of an egalitarian world, well beyond the state. I mean, what lessons does this history offer us
Well,
for our understanding of what freedom is, and why is it being so silenced?
I think this is a very important question, and there's lots of issues that come out of the Haitian Revolution which have not been addressed. I think we have to start with one point, that the generals of what was called the indigenous army, by the way. So the way the revolution is usually put is that black slaves were able to rise up under the leadership of, say, Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines and others, and to achieve independence. And that was the revolution. Achieving independence was the end. A number of points need to be made. First of all, that Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Toussaint, and all the leaders of the generals and so on were individuals who happened to have been manumitted. They were manumitted slaves, meaning that the French freed them. The French said, now you're freed because you're civilized. It's that kind of thing. They were manumitted. In other words, they were freed by the colonial power. All right. All the soldiers and all the ones who were doing all the fighting, who incidentally overwhelmingly were born in Africa and who were Africans, freed themselves. They were not manumitted. They freed themselves through struggle. Now, the ones who were manumitted, who were freed by the French, were called Creoles. They're the ones who were born in Haiti, as opposed to the Bossales who were born in Africa. And the ones who were manumitted, who were born in Haiti, thought of themselves as superior, saw themselves as black, but as equal to whites. Look at us. We are your equals. We have succeeded in having a revolution in the same way that you had your revolution. So we must be taken seriously. No? That's their statement towards the French in particular. The Bossales, on the other hand, didn't fight for independence in 1804. They weren't so much interested in independence. What they were interested in was the end of slavery. And they fought against slavery and the attempts by Napoleon to reinstitute it, when a lot of the black generals were fighting on the French side. And it's only in 1803 that the French generals were forced back to go and fight on the side of the Haitians, of the ex-slaves. They forced them back. So, if we understand, and this is the point that is made strongly by Jean Casimir, which I think his book is absolutely fantastic, very, very important, is that the African ex-slaves freed themselves through struggle and freed themselves from a racial appellation of negro, of Negroes, because they realized that being called negro was the first step to being enslaved. So they were saying, we are not Negroes, we are humans. So they fight against a racial appellation, whereas in fact the Creole adopted with pride. And in fact, many of the Creole were dismissive of Africans. They thought of themselves as superior and saw Africans, the Bossales, who were overwhelmingly from Africa, as uncouth, uneducated, backward, uncivilized, you name it. So there is a clear distinction here. It's not the case so much that the Creole wanted to return Haiti to the past. Rather, what they wanted to do was to continue with the plantation system on the basis of wage labor. But the ex-slaves refused to be wage laborers because they saw the plantation system itself as being the source of their oppression. And in any case, they weren't being paid anything. They had kind of, to use Marx's expression, it was wage slavery. In other words, they were still treated in a subhuman way. And both Toussaint, Dessalines, and that's the reason why Dessalines was murdered, was assassinated incidentally, and others wanted to continue with the plantation system. Dessalines himself apparently owned 30 plantations. Can you imagine? 30 plantations. And then he calls himself emperor, you know? So people celebrate Dessalines because he said all citizens of Haiti will now be called black, irrespective of the color of your skin. But this guy was quite, he was mimetic. He was just copying Europeans. And he wanted to continue exploiting black workers, the ex-slaves, and they rebel. And they force the Creole to abandon the whole idea of continuing with plantations and allocating land to them, which they divide up into small parcels, and are able to develop a reasonably egalitarian society of parcel-owning peasants. And the way they do it, it's all sophisticated. It's all quite detailed in the literature. So they help each other, and they have collective cultural restrictions to people who are accumulating and becoming too wealthy. So you could be high up in the hierarchy in terms of money or the land that you own, but not that high. But someone else could be high up in the hierarchy on another dimension, and another person on another dimension, you see. It requires a certain degree of equalization all over. So they set up what is an egalitarian society of small parcel owners, which they have small family parcel owners. And that only ends in 1915 when the Americans invade. So from 1804 to 1915, the Bossales were able to develop a relatively egalitarian system in the countryside. And they called it le pays en dehors, the country outside, or the place outside, beyond the place beyond the cities, right? So, the
Sure.
state had to find different ways of raising a surplus and getting its money. And they did that through trade and so on.
I mean, this brings us to this issue about which you're very critical about the figure of the heroic liberator.
Oh, that's something
Toussaint,
else. Yeah, yeah.
Mandela, and so on, Kenyatta and Nkrumah, whatever. Okay, so how does this myth making function, and what are the alternative forms of leadership and political subjectivity for a genuine emancipatory movement? I mean, I'll come back to talking about the experience of the UDF in South Africa,
Yeah.
but I thought this is quite an important issue just to highlight since we are talking about precisely that.
I was struck by one experience that someone at Mandela's funeral, some young woman who was attending the funeral, was recorded as saying, I came here because it was Mandela who liberated our country. Mandela liberated me and my people. So it struck me as extraordinary because Mandela didn't liberate anyone. No single individual could liberate anyone. In fact, it was Mandela who was freed from prison by the struggle of the people of South Africa in the 1980s. And of course, foreign pressure, but fundamentally by the struggle of the people of the country. So, how is it that one person can become seen as what Fanon calls a demiurge, the demiurge being in Greek antiquity, the craftsman who can do everything and who can construct the world. One single individual which has this superpower that he can free a whole society. How is that myth arrived at? And you can see it. I mean, Mandela was considered as a saint, and initially he was considered a terrorist by the Thatcher regime, right? Eventually he becomes an international saint. You know, he's the one, and he even says, look, people think I'm a saint, but I'm not. I'm just an ordinary person. But it's not him as an individual who is the issue, I don't think. It is a myth which is founded on him and which develops in the same way like Gandhi is seen as some kind of saint. I mean, give us a break. It's not, of course, anything to do, well, at least the real, instead of material, is purely ideological. And the way it develops, I think, although it's actually quite complicated, I think you can see it in Gandhi also. The way people begin to believe, especially when they're in a weak position vis-a-vis colonial power, that this one individual can succeed in doing what they have been unable to do. So there's a kind of transference. There's a kind of way of saying this one individual represents everyone. Mandela wasn't just Mandela. When Mandela got freed, it was like South Africa was free. So Mandela was the nation, not just represents the nation, but is in fact the nation. It can happen that a certain individual, acquires in the mind of people, especially when they feel that their struggles have been unable to achieve what they wanted. In other words, to assert their humanity, that this character, this person, is not just a person, but is a kind of super person who has the power to achieve what we can't achieve. So let him achieve what we can't achieve. You see, it is a way of saying, and it's usually a man. That's why I'm saying he, because it's always he. There's no she so much. The he in question is someone which is anointed. I don't know if it's the right term, but provided with capacities which seem to be superhuman in the sense that he embodies the nation. He is the embodiment of the nation. He's not just an individual who happens to be, he's the embodiment of the nation. And that struck me as amazing. Oh, that was extraordinary. And I think that's very, very important because it systematically undermines people's capacity to say, oh, we can do things ourselves. We can't do things ourselves anymore. We're going to just pass on the baton or whatever it is to some super person who's going to do it all for us, who's going to free us. And of course, Mandela constructs the nation. He's nice to everyone. He's able to reconcile. He's not vindictive about being locked up in prison for so long. So that's another, that's his history. He's been there for 70 years or whatever the case may be. He's able to go and talk to to whites, including Fairfoot's widow, and say, "Look, we're all part of the same South Africa," and so on. So he unifies the nation. He has this aura. Well, he's able to do that, and of course, as soon as he dies, the nation starts to disintegrate. You see, he's the
But I
one who
mean,
put things together.
the, but there's a sort of strange irony with when I mean, in the 80s, you had huge mass movement evolve. You had the United Democratic Front, which was effectively experiment of politics without a party.
Yes,
And so, what caused? You use the term saturation. What caused it saturate? What?
the term
And,
comes from Sylvain Lazarus. I mean, it's a
yeah,
saturation of their politics, of their subjectivities. They're not able to continue to resolve the problems that they're confronted with, so they collapse. When I discussed the UDF, I only discussed it for during a short period, 1984 to mid 1984 to mid 1986. So the UDF started in 1983, right? Ends in 1990. What is it? 1993 or something. It lasts about 10 years in terms of an organization, but its politics become emancipatory only during that particular 1.5 year period. And I think during that particular period, you have the development of popular organizations which are guiding the process of transformation. Like, for example, street committees or area committees, where people decide themselves in communities to fight their own problems and resolve their own problems collectively. Mm. So, in a sense, the power comes from below during that particular period. And the subjectivity of the leadership takes that into account. They say we are democratic, we're allowing the grassroots to control us and to so on, but we provide some kind of direction. So it's actually very interesting as an organization because it's not a political party. So its purpose is not to achieve state power. And that's simply because it believes that the ANC in exile should come back and achieve and take over. There's no real organized presence of the ANC in the country. It's banned. So I mean, there's some underground cells and so on, but there's nothing, no organized structures as such. So that organization is highly democratic. It discusses even under conditions of repression and states of emergency, blah blah blah. It is able during 1985 anyway, the first state of emergency. It's enabled to organize itself and to rely on the masses, as one of our leaders used to say. Therefore, bring them in so that they're the ones who make decisions. But gradually, what happens is part of it is the second state of emergency in 1986, where thousands of people are arrested, some activists are arrested. But I insist more in this because I've discussed this already in a previous work of mine. But in this, what I try and draw attention to is this whole idea of democracy. Because once you start talking about democracy and you enter into negotiations, you're going to have a different understanding of democracy from the ones that you are negotiating with maintaining. So ultimately, they settle on, of course, liberal democracy, which they import from Britain. Mandela says his idea of democracy was always the British system. So so the decline, in a sense, of that mass movement is enabled by a whole number of processes. Various activists are arrested, others enter into top positions and become ANC people when the ANC is unbanned and so on and so on. And then there's negotiations and negotiations surrounded by the term democracy. And then when someone says, well, when we're talking about democracy, we can't possibly insist on the popular kind of democracy and the street committees that we're having because, it's a matter of negotiation. They won't allow that. The best we can achieve is liberal democracy. And there you go. So it all revolves around the term democracy. And one of the arguments of the book is that the concept of democracy is highly problematic. From
Yeah,
antiquity to
yeah,
the present, it's highly problematic. When you're using the term democracy, you are frequently on the state's camp. You know, it's very difficult for you to extricate yourself from those discussions. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that brings us to this point that the book concludes by discussing the neocolonial state's three modes of rule
Yes.
and the political limitation of movementism. Where do you see the seeds of a new emancipatory politics emerging today? And what do you believe are the key organizational and strategic questions that must be addressed from resistance to a coherent project for liberation?
All that in 5 minutes, heroes. It's not possible. But let me try. Let me try steps.
But it is what we've been talking about,
Yes, it is.
and
Because
so it's
that's what,
drawing those threads together.
yes. You see, so what struck me as a problem for thought was how a society could consider itself democratic, while on the other hand, systematically going around killing people and engaging in extreme violence. And there's examples of this happening in South Africa, as we know. How can you have a democratic system which rules in such a way that it kills people? Now, that exercises political violence. Now, the answer that I came to was that the state, is only democratic for some, not democratic for all. That in fact, what happens is, it seems to me, is that liberal democracy is founded on this idea that you have to have a vibrant civil society, which is something that everyone went on about in the 90s. It has to be vibrant. I'm sure you remember the formulation. Vibrant civil. Now, what is civil society? Civil society is the domain of the rights bearing citizen. Citizens in civil society have rights, and they can therefore defend those rights by accessing courts of law, organizing in movements to defend their rights. And basically, that is what a modern democratic, liberal democratic society consists of, in theory. The problem is that not everyone in neocolonial Africa is ruled in that way as if they lived in civil society. In fact, some people don't have the right to rights. Those who live in civil society have full rights, have the right to exercise their rights. This is a distinction that Hannah Arendt makes, which I think is very important. You have the right to rights. In other words, no one is going to contest the fact that, you have those rights. You can go to court and make sure that the state enforces those rights, for instance. And it's based on the right of private property and so on. If you don't live within the domain of civil society, you are not ruled through a regime of rights. A regime of rights is a mode of rule whereby the state gives you rights and you give legitimacy to the state, and you have what is called the rule of law. You operate within the rule of law. But a lot of people don't live within those conditions. They don't have the right to rights. That means they can be subjected to extreme violence, even though they are supposed to be full citizens. They are full citizens. They, in theory, they have the right to vote. They have the papers, the IDs, of this, that, the other. But they don't have the right to rights. In other words, they are not given the absolute right to enforce those rights all the time. one of the common example that I give is that, when the policeman knocks on my door and wants to look in my house, he has to come with a court order. There's no way he's entering the house without a court order, and he knows this. But if you go to a poor area, the police just kick the doors down. In other words, they don't go and look for a court order in order to enter somebody's home. So it's a completely different way of treating different sectors of the population. Of course, in civil society, overwhelmingly middle class, the middle class citizens and those in what I call uncivil society are not usually middle class, but they nevertheless are citizens. But they're treated with contempt. They are still dehumanized, which is precisely what Abachali, Basim, John Donald keep on going on about. We are dehumanized. We're not considered as completely human, right? They are systematically subjected to violence. Not occasionally, as is the case in civil society, but systematically subjected to violence. So that's another domain of state politics where the state rules through very much through violence being deployed, not as a last resort, but as a first resort. And finally, I think there's also a third realm still on the continent where people resist or people really live within a context which what governs their life is so-called traditional ways of doing things, traditional cultural norms and values. The extreme dominance of patriarchy, the centrality of land, the rule of traditional chiefs, and so on. And they have to be able to navigate their lives and through deploying discourses and subjectivities which are of a different order. They're not about human rights. They're not necessarily about violence, although violence can exist, but they are principally about deploying narratives of tradition and culture and custom. So the state, rules them, these people overwhelmingly rule through so-called traditional authorities and chieftaincies and whatever. And that happens very much to the extent that a lot of these traditional authorities set up businesses, big businesses, mining companies and what have you. Therefore, the point then is to ask, where does resistance come from? And what are the conditions for that resistance being able to move towards some kind of emancipatory politics? You'll recall that in Fanon's analysis of The Wretched of the Earth, he talks of colonial society as being dualistic, Manichaean, he says. He says there's not only there's the two parts of the city, but there's two ways of thinking. There's the colonial thing who thinks superiority of whiteness and white civilization. And then there's the dominated, the colonized who think differently. And then through a process of struggle, a dialectical process of struggle, those differences are transformed into a unified national consciousness. A national consciousness which is built from below. It's not nationalism. It's a national consciousness built from below. Fanon's very good because he distinguishes the nation from the state. So he says a national consciousness is built from below by the people themselves. And that is unifying. It understands that national consciousness understands that there are many whites who are more committed to the process of independent struggle than a lot of sons of the nation, as he refers them to very first. Now, the problem under colonialism is that you only have two sectors. The problem now we're talking about here is that we have three. So, unifying the various forms of resistance in the three sectors becomes a major problem. What are the forms of resistance which take place in civil society? Well, we've mentioned them already. They are social movements which want to reassert the rights of various groups or that are systematically struggling against corruption in government and so on. Those are the kind of struggles that are taking place in civil society. What are the struggles that are taking place in uncivil society? Those are the struggles that fundamentally are opposed to violence because their lives are dominated by violence. And people want access to resources, which they are denied. And that is why they feel they are subhumanized, if you like. And then finally, in the domain of the traditionalist society that I refer to, which is based on culture, where discussions take place in culture and narratives take place with culture and tradition, what we have there is very frequently the chiefs abusing their power, letting transnational corporations come in and wanting to plunder the resources which exist underground, to set up mines in areas where people live, and undermine their communities and destroy their communities and their ancestral lands where their ancestors are buried and so on and so on. They have to confront this because the chief is usually in alliance with the transnational corporations. So, so their struggles are different again. Sometimes there's overlap, but most of the cases they're confronting different modes of rule, different forms of oppression. So it's actually difficult to provide a new form of national consciousness. What has happened in South Africa is then that the national consciousness that seems to be dominant at the moment seems to be fascistic. It seems to be an idea of a nation, this time nationalism, which is what brings people together in the nation is the fact that they're all opposed to foreigners. They're all xenophobic. And that is extremely worrying, right? So, how then can you transform? And I think, I mean, obviously, the most advanced and most sophisticated of these movements, as you know, is Abatlali, Basem Jondolo. But they still operate on this notion that we are the poor. They haven't, I think, which, I mean, from my point of view, it's not just a politics of the poor that you have to develop. It's a new politics for the whole nation. What would the South African nation look like from the perspective of the poor? That, I think, is the more important. And thereby, you can unify people beyond your social location. You move outside your social location and you bring in other people in. And what does it mean? It means that you have to think about what the common good is. Fundamentally, any transformation which is emancipatory has to have some idea of what is common for everyone. What does everyone need in common? What are the features of life which everyone requires? Whether it is electricity, roads, transport, education, you name it. All this stuff has to be included in such a way that the whole nation benefits from it. If that movement can develop this idea of what is in common, the common good, the national good, then we should be able to advance to a new conception of the nation along the lines that Fanon talked about national consciousness. If not, you tend to be stuck within your social movement location and can't get out of the location. You understand?
But it has to be driven by the perceptions and conceptions and aspirations of les dames de la terre. I think
Yes,
that
absolutely.
absolutely has to be the driving force of that.
No, absolutely.
Well, Michael, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I could sit here and continue with this for days, if not. But I think we've covered a lot of ground in terms of at least introducing people to some of the rich thinking that's in your book. And I really like to thank you for sparing time to discuss it. I know there's so much more we could talk about. Perhaps we can arrange a further discussions, perhaps bring in a panel to look at particular aspects that you elaborate in much more detail in the book. But I would strongly recommend to everyone that this is a really important book, and Beyond the Neocolonial is an, I would suggest, essential reading for all of us, or whether we are engaged in primarily intellectual work or also being involved in organizing and activism. So thank you, Michael, for joining us. Once again, thank you, Michael, for today's discussion.
Thank you very much, Firoj. It's been an absolute pleasure.
You were listening to an interview with Michael Neocosmos about his book, Beyond the Neocolonial, Africa and the Dialectics of Human Emancipation. The book is available on Daraja Press at darajapress.com. This episode was produced by Pierre Loisel, music by Arlo Maverick. I'm Firoz Manji. Thanks for listening.